There are wounds that don't come from being yelled at. They come from spending years wondering why you never quite felt safe being yourself. Maybe no one ever called your childhood abusive. Maybe your parents worked hard. Maybe they made immense sacrifices. Maybe they genuinely loved you in the only ways they knew how. So why does a part of you still feel like you're always trying to earn something that should have been freely given? Why do you replay conversations long after they've ended? Why does one disappointed look from someone stay with you for hours? Why do you feel guilty for having needs, even when they're completely reasonable? What if the hardest part of growing up wasn't what happened to you, but what quietly never happened at all? Not every childhood leaves obvious scars. Some leave questions that follow you into adulthood without you even realizing where they came from. Because of this, you become the person everyone describes as easygoing, the one who doesn't ask for much, the one who's always understanding, the one who's always there for everyone else. But beneath that version of you, there's a quiet exhaustion. You've spent so much of your life making space for other people's emotions that you've forgotten what it feels like to make space for your own. And maybe you've wondered why. Why being loved has always felt different from feeling safe. Why compliments are so easy to dismiss, but criticism echoes in your mind for days. Why even after achieving something you've worked incredibly hard for, your first thought isn't pride. It's wondering whether it was enough. If any of this feels familiar, the answer might not be hidden in who you are today. It might be hidden in who you had to become as a child. Growing up with emotionally immature parents doesn't always create loud pain. Sometimes it creates invisible survival habits. Habits that look so normal, you don't even realize they're survival at all. Maybe you remember coming home excited to tell someone about your day. You'd already imagined how the conversation would go. You couldn't wait to share the funny thing that happened at school, or the compliment someone gave you, or the tiny achievement that made you feel proud. But before you could finish, the conversation somehow became about someone else. Your parent interrupted with their own story, or they barely looked up, or they answered with a distracted, "That's nice," or somehow they turned your excitement into advice, correction, or criticism. It wasn't one huge moment, it was hundreds of tiny moments that quietly taught you something, that your emotions weren't important enough to hold someone else's attention. So little by little, you stopped sharing as much. You stopped expecting people to understand, and without realizing it, you began carrying your inner world completely alone. At first, it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like growing up, like becoming mature. You learned not to cry too much, not to complain, not to make things harder for anyone else. Adults praised you for being so understanding, so responsible, so easy to raise. But children aren't supposed to carry the emotional weight of the people raising them. They're supposed to feel safe enough to simply be children. Instead, you became incredibly good at reading the room. You noticed the smallest change in someone's voice, the way a door closed a little harder than usual, the silence that meant someone was upset, the expression that told you today wasn't the day to ask for anything. Without anyone teaching you, you became an expert at predicting emotions before they were spoken. Not because you were naturally gifted, but because your nervous system was trying to protect you. When a parent's emotions are unpredictable, a child learns that paying attention can prevent pain. So you started adjusting yourself. If they were stressed, you stayed quiet. If they were angry, you became helpful. If they were disappointed, you somehow felt responsible. Over time, something subtle happened. You stopped asking yourself, "What am I feeling?" and started asking, "What does everyone else need from me right now?" That question followed you into adulthood. It became the invisible filter through which you experienced every relationship. Before speaking, you wonder how your words will be received. Before saying no, you imagine how guilty you'd feel. Before expressing hurt, you worry more about the other person's reaction than your own pain. From the outside, it looks like kindness, empathy, and selflessness. But underneath, it's often fear. The fear that disappointing someone might cost you love. Because when emotional safety depends on someone else's mood, love never feels steady. It feels conditional. Something that can disappear if you say the wrong thing, need too much, or simply become inconvenient. They may have loved you deeply, but they didn't always know how to make you feel emotionally safe. There's a difference. One is about intention. The other is about experience. As a child, you don't think my parent doesn't know how to regulate their emotions. You think it must be me. And that single belief can quietly shape the rest of your life. If your emotions were dismissed, you learned to dismiss them too. If your needs were treated like inconveniences, you eventually stopped believing they deserved to exist. That's why so many adults who grew up this way struggle with a question that seems incredibly simple. What do you want? You've spent so many years becoming the person everyone else needed, that you lost touch with the person you actually are. Eventually you begin to mistake survival for your personality. You tell yourself, I'm just an overthinker. I'm just a people pleaser. I've always been this way. But what if those aren't personality traits at all? What if they're adaptations? Ways a younger version of you learned to stay connected to the people you depended on most. Because for a child, connection isn't optional, it's survival. Perhaps the most confusing part is this. Emotionally immature parents aren't always cruel. Many are funny, hardworking, and generous. They may have celebrated your achievements, but when it came to your inner world, your fears, your disappointments, your need to simply be understood, they often didn't know how to meet you there. Not always because they didn't care, but because no one had ever taught them how. They inherited emotional wounds they never learned to recognize, and without meaning to, they passed them on. Understanding that can change the way you see your past, but remember, an explanation is not the same as an excuse. You can understand why someone became who they are, and still acknowledge the pain they caused. Both truths can exist at the same time. Healing doesn't begin when you convince yourself your pain wasn't real. It begins when you stop arguing with it. The voice that says, don't ask for too much, just keep everyone happy, wasn't born with you. It was built. And if it was built, it can be rebuilt. Every time you say no without apologizing for existing, every time you let yourself cry instead of pushing the feeling away, you are teaching your nervous system a lesson it never got to learn as a child. Healing isn't a single breakthrough. It's 1,000 quiet moments that almost no one else will ever see. It's catching yourself before you apologize for something that wasn't your fault.